Okay, thanks, Tim. I feel like I've been put in a slightly disadvantaged position because everyone sort of covered everything I was going to say already in some form. So what I think I'm going to do is I'll go through the slides, but mostly try to tie together what people have said and kind of put it in the context of the way I think about it, coming sort of from the research labs and from a research perspective. So this may be really quick, and we can make it more interactive if you want to discuss any of the topics, but we've kind of gone through a lot of these things. As you can see, this is sort of teed up as a way to introduce a topic, and I find myself now more in the position of summarizing it. So let's go through some quick level setting about what is big data, because I actually think that we've heard about 2 or 3 different definitions of what it is today. Why the telecoms are find themselves in this area, other than the obvious reasons we've talked about so far. Some of the boundaries and barriers that exist, and I've kind of left one of them out that we've already talked about quite a bit, which is the privacy legal side. But certainly the technology boundaries and business boundaries, I think we've discussed some as well. And then sort of talk about, at the end, where big data is headed, how it's used, and how it probably will be used over the next maybe 2 or 3 years. So let's talk about what big data is and is not. First, big data is a marketing term, so it can be anything to anyone. We've had people come up here and talk about a 50 million row table is big data. Well, 50 million rows pretty much works comfortably in a data warehouse, so I don't think that's big data. To me, big data has to be something that is so large that it's intractable to be done in your traditional Oracle, Teradata data warehouses. That you need something with massive parallelism to be able to handle it. And so that's what I think of big data. And so that's why it's more like on the order of terabytes, petabytes. Exabytes is probably an exaggeration, but terabytes, several hundreds of terabytes, tens to hundreds of terabytes of data. It's semi-structured to unstructured, as well as combining, obviously, the structured data that we had from before. So that's also new. It's not really the same as just going back to your Oracle table and pulling an answer out. And the schemas are flatter, they're not as complex, and the interrelationships between the tables aren't as many. So this is what big data is to me from a research perspective. Why have we been talking about it? Well, obviously we've had the revolution in computer technology. I mean, people walking around with a cell phone in their pocket has got the computational horsepower of what a supercomputer was, 20 years ago. And so taking the microprocessor Moore's law, hard drives, storage costs have gone down. It follows its own power law. And then, of course, memory is cheap. So you combine those together and you have a computational capability that enables us to look at now vast amounts of data very efficiently, both in terms of time and in terms of cost. So where do telecoms fit in? Telecom companies traditionally, as many of you know, XDRs, call data records, text data records, just mostly structured in that world. Care information is probably the only place where you could talk about as an unstructured place. And so and as we've heard already, I think, from our friend from T-Mobile, quite a bit of work done with care records. And then the big one for us now is the IP or electronic data records. And so those dwarf any of the previous records and any of the previous data. And so it is its own exponentially rising curve. So let's talk a bit about the challenges. Technology is, I think one of the previous speakers from, our friend from T-Mobile, as well as a couple of others, talked about the difficulty you have in an organization to change and the skill sets that you have there. So I think the description someone gave was the guy who's running the business right now. Oh, it was the gentleman who ran his own consulting firm doing, I can't remember his name right now, but anyway, he talked about how the guy who's running the IT organization got there because he had done something a certain way, and he has a small staff of people who are very good at using those technologies. And as a result, they think the answer to the next problem is exactly that same problem again, doing the same technology, maybe the next generation. And this is where he ran into the trouble with big data, because big data requires a new technology, a new way of looking at things. And so that's probably one of the big impediments right now. We're going to talk about a boundary or something that gets in the way. For telecoms in particular, it's the own organizational inertia that already exists. They do things a certain way now, they sell things a certain way, their businesses operate in a certain way, and to make any significant change is a big task, because it requires a culture change. It requires an investment, it requires risk, and it requires things to do different that they've never done before. And so in technology terms, that turns into, you have these relational databases, you have cold storage, you have vendor lock-in, all of which keeps the budgets and the investments from flowing into a new area that would enable big data analytics. So I'm obviously talking about some of the familiar names I'm sure you've heard of, but for data warehouses, it's a cost for doing processing on the order of $10,000 or more per terabyte, which if you're doing hundreds or thousands of terabytes starts to turn into real money. And if you're trying to prove out a business case, as I think we were talking about earlier, requiring millions of dollars of investment up front before you can actually prove it, then you're obviously going to run into some challenges getting that getting that kind of investment from senior management. These technologies had limited unstructured data capability, and so as a result, a lot of unstructured data, for example, care data, or data that we're actually pulling from websites and web browsing, basically sits unused. It's sitting on the floor. No one can do it because they don't have the tools, and they can't get the investment to be able to process and understand it. And probably the biggest inertial problem we face, at least in my company, is we have right now stovepipes of data sitting, because it's a decentralized organization. We've got analytics being done all over the company in all these different silos. Each has their own system, each has a copy of data similar to, but not exactly like, the next person or next to the next group over. And so as a result, you end up having this distribution of data, most of which is redundant, people doing their own analytics on it and coming up with reports and answers that they then feed back at the top, which disagree with each other. And so from a management standpoint, it's a real problem. And it's also a product of what happens when you sort of have this lock-in and everybody running off and doing their own system. So this enters sort of the direction that we're looking into right now quite seriously, and I think several of our competitors have also looked quite seriously and are investing in it. And that's sort of the Hadoop platform. And it's, people, show of hands, familiar with Hadoop? Do I need to kind of go into this? All right, so you're all pretty familiar. It's an open source platform. It pioneered at Google and Yahoo and the other in Silicon Valley companies. To do massive data processing. And everyone thinks of Hadoop and they say, oh, it's unstructured data. But I actually come from Yahoo, and the only thing I used was structured data with it. It's actually a great platform for it because it is a parallel distributed processing system. And so I was able to do joins, just basic mathematical database type functions with huge tables that would have never, I'd still be waiting for the report to come back if I used it in one of the traditional data warehouses. So it's actually quite useful for structured and unstructured data. And its cost is, the cost of Hadoop is obviously its big selling point. In addition to the computational power it brings to bear, it's also on the order of hundreds to $1,000 per terabyte, as opposed to 10,000 plus per terabyte. So with that kind of investment, with that kind of scale, you can actually get the investment, because it's not that much, to be able to prove out a system. And that's kind of where we are right now. We've managed to convince our managers and senior management that there's something there, and that we can get, it's not that expensive, especially when you consider the cost of a single project with the old paradigm. For that price, we can literally run what I would say is probably 80–90% of the business's data needs. So it's a pretty compelling value proposition by order of magnitude. So we're looking into it quite seriously. And so that enters sort of the picture of what you can do with big data. And we've heard a lot of different use cases and areas today. And I kind of grouped them. I stole this from Richard Benjamins at Telefonica, who is Telefonica is quite on the edge, I think, from what I've heard of their activities, of what can be done in big data. And so I think the one that we've all heard a lot of is you can run a better telco, right? That's churn management, marketing, network optimization, that sort of thing. All of those activities we've heard about, big data is sort of the next step of doing what people have already done in the past with maybe limited data sets or sample data sets. Now you can do it with all the data. The next one up would be mobile advertising. And this is an area where I think, well, as we've already heard now, Pinsight is an example that Sprint has introduced, but the other companies are also run similar kinds of mobile advertising where you take basically extracting more revenue from your existing subscriber base in a different form. The next level sort of on the value chain would be the offering of data products, and that's kind of what I guess Verizon and AT&T have sort of started dipping their toes into, and that is, there's a very large market research infrastructure within the world, and it's global, and companies wanting to understand their markets, their customers, where they can market their products and how they can sell. They employ companies like ComScore, GfK, Nielsen to understand markets. And our telco data, anonymized and aggregated, can inform them about market trends and behaviors in ways that that those companies could only just estimate and dream of before. And then the last one is sort of managing data. And this is an interesting area. I'm not sure, maybe you all have a perspective on whether it's going to go there. But this is along the lines a bit of what Michael Saylor was talking about in his keynote, which is as the cell phone, as the cellular device becomes an increasingly pervasive part of our personality and our person, then the telecommunications carrier becomes in a unique position of trust. As already having a fiduciary trust with its subscribers, it could also leverage that relationship to become a steward of their data or their for mobile wallet or other relationships. And so in much the same way as we sort of trust other proxies to sort of manage things for us, the telco could become a manager of data. So I just have some slides that you already have probably heard and seen and talked about, which is marketing and churn analytics, customer experience. I think we've already talked about that quite a bit, and network operations. The one I guess I'll spend a little bit more time on is maybe mobile advertising. There have been a couple of really interesting tests going on. I think to answer your question, if I could, where in 3 years are we going to be? These are all, as you can see right now, these are all experiments. Pinsight's an experiment. Verizon's precision marketing, it's an experiment. O2 is doing an experiment in the UK. Deutsche Telekom has an insurance product that they're offering right now. And so, as you know, as was alluded to earlier, the rules in the European Union are a lot stricter than they are here. And so you have to have explicit opt-in for them. And so this insurance product, for example, that Deutsche Telekom has announced, it's an app that sits on your phone. And if you head to the airport on a Friday or Saturday, they reasonably infer that you're headed for a vacation, and they pop up an insurance offering for travel insurance. And so they've got a collaboration with an insurance carrier, and they've got it all set up so that you can literally buy it through the application right on your phone. And so we'll see how these things play out. I think the next 3 years will show whether there is a there. And invariably there will be some failures, but there might be some successes, and that's where the market will move. The last area I guess I would also talk about that we might see more traction in is sort of this area of anonymized and aggregated data. And that's the idea that you take all those network events, those location profiles and location data, and you start to infer things about that would be of interest to understand how the populations move and what they do. And this is not a nefarious activity. In fact, there are a lot of public good type, public service activities that are being contemplated and experimented on. In the Netherlands, for example, where once again you have really strict privacy laws, they took except in the case of the government, where they're allowed to use it, they took people's data of where they were and they used it to do crowd control and monitoring during some of the big parade events that went on. And so they were able to then see, okay, large crowds of people moving in this direction, and the government was able, the police force was able to deploy the appropriate crowd control to be able to make sure that large streams, flows of people didn't collide or hit constricted areas, and so it made the event a lot safer. Another example of this kind of thing also has to do with commuting patterns and the railroads, to understand how full are the trains and where more capacity needs to be added. So there are opportunities for this kind of insight into what people are doing, just to understand and to improve services, public services, as well as products. Some of the work that we've done or we've looked at as in these domains really revolve around population profiling, and just to understand the movements of crowds and the movements of people, where they come from, where they go to. One of the examples that we like to talk about is, if you can imagine a very large retail outlet, retail center, I don't know, a casino, for example, since we're in Vegas. I mean, how do you know how many people are actually in the building? There are quite a few doors, and unless you have someone with a little clicker, you really don't know how many people are moving around your casino. Where did they come from? Did they come from the casino next door? Did they just fly in from town? Are they staying here? I mean, we hear stories that we know that people who stay here in, say, the Venetian don't necessarily gamble here. Maybe they gamble at the Wynn instead. But understanding the movement of people, if you're an operator, really helps you to understand your own customer. And so you can do things to try and perhaps incent them to stay here to gamble. Or if you're trying to understand where your population is coming from, are they coming from the Northeast or from the Midwest? Or maybe we need to target our marketing more in areas where we're not seeing the kind of uptick we would like. So those are all don't require personal information. It's just general population type movement. The who are your friends is an interesting one. I think our friend from T-Mobile often talked about that, and it's a very interesting area where you build that social graph and you understand the communities and the leaders and the followers, and you can in fact infer quite a number of things about people from it. You can infer you can infer their demographic information. It may surprise you, but a carrier actually has very little information about most of its subscribers, because there's so many plans that are done by, for example, a corporate plan or a family plan, where all we know is the head, the person who started it. And all of the seven phones, I think someone else says they have 7 kids, we have no idea how old the kids are, where they live, what they do. Are they still at home? Are they off at college? Have they moved out entirely? And so that connected graph is very important because it helps us to infer and learn more about our customers. So that pretty much kind of concludes where I was going to go with this. I think I'm sorry if I sounded like a repeat of a lot of what was already said, but I was sort of expecting to be more in the earlier part of the phase, but it was a bit of a wrap. If anyone has any questions or wants to talk about some of the subjects, happy to. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. With a lot of speakers here, it's been pretty kind of web-centric, URL-centric. What's the shift you've seen? I know we've seen the smartphone shift today. Shift in terms of data usage and analytics from kind of browser-based, URL-based to app-based.
Oh, from browsers to apps.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, I mean that's a bit harder for us because. From the carrier side, it just comes across as an IP call, right? But we can kind of infer from, if it's a Facebook thing, it's probably off the Facebook app. So, I mean, I would say that it's a huge portion. I don't really know because honestly, one of my primary problems right now is the electronic data records is so vast. I mean, it dwarfs. So everyone talks about CDRs, and that's a lot of data. The IP and electronic data records dwarfs that. I mean, it's enormous. It's almost an order of magnitude more data than call data records. So, yeah, go ahead.
I apologize if I missed this comment earlier. Does Sprint sell this profile information to commercial entities?
No.
Or marketing companies? So it's strictly for internal use?
No, well, those things were just, so I run a research lab. This was an experiment. We were playing with the idea, say, what could we do, what could we find? And it was a lab experiment, so.
Then why doesn't Sprint sell that information? Does it seem like there'd be a big market for that type of information? Is it a privacy issue or what?
It's a number of things. I mean, certainly privacy figures prominently in anything that we do, and trying to maintain and protect privacy. But it's also part and parcel goes back to the inertia I talked about earlier, which is, I mean, I come from a company that basically sells handsets in minutes. And so the idea that you and I can sit in a room and say, gee, that makes sense, and there should be a market for that, and why don't we go out and sell it? That's because we're kind of entrepreneurial by nature, right? But you talk to the people in a carrier, and the first question is, well, how many tens of millions is it going to move the needle? We're a $35 billion company. Why do I want to invest in that, right? And so while I might be able to say, yes, but you could make money on this, the answer is, well, we don't even know how to sell that. How do you sell something? That's we sell handsets in minutes. So part of the reason why we aren't selling it, one, obviously there are privacy issues we have to work through, and we need to make sure that we're on the right side of the law with that before we engage in the activity. And two, we don't actually have the organizational competence yet to put together that kind of an offering, to go out and sell it. So that has to be done. And so this is to your point earlier, where will we be in 3 years? We're going to be experimenting and trying to build up those organizational competencies to be able to leverage and take advantage of some of the things that hopefully these experiments will have proven out. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Go ahead.
Can you comment a little bit on Insight, specifically what it's offering, and maybe a little bit?
Not really. I'll be honest. I don't know that much about Pinsight because it's still in the, from my perspective, it's still in the formative stages. I mean, I know they've launched it, and I know they want to do mobile advertising with it, but I think that they're still just getting under their feet under themselves. There is Kevin McGinnis, who is the VP of product. He's at the conference here, and he's a much better authority on exactly what their plans are, but I don't actually know where they're going to go with it. Like I said, I kind of run the research labs, and they've taken that product and they're off and running with it, so it's out of my hands. Any questions?